The Republican would.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, this morning the U.S. Trade Representative is testifying before the Senate Finance Committee on President Biden's 2023 trade policy agenda. And I look forward to asking her about the details of the Biden administration's plans, or lack thereof, to boost trade opportunities for American workers, farmers and ranchers, and businesses. Mr. President, trade has been a very low priority on the President's list throughout the first 2 years of his administration. To name just one example, it took the President a year and a half to nominate a confirmable chief agricultural negotiator at the U.S. Trade Representative's office, even though agriculture is a U.S. industry that depends upon trade. And Mr. President, if the President has de-emphasized trade, he has really de-emphasized trade. That is, removing trade and tariff barriers and increasing market access for American producers. The administration is currently negotiating exactly 0 comprehensive free trade agreements, and its so-called trade initiative frameworks are largely flowery rhetoric with little to nothing in the way of tangible and durable benefits for American workers. Tariff reduction and increased market access, the hallmarks of free trade agreements, are notably missing in action from the Biden administration's trade initiatives. In fact, President Biden's trade representative has openly said that the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, perhaps the President's signature trade initiative, was designed not to include tariff reduction. So why is this a problem? Well, first of all, Mr. President, it's a problem because trade is essential to our economy. More than 41 million U.S. jobs depend on trade, and that includes a lot of jobs at small businesses. In fact, 98% of U.S. exporters are small businesses, a stat that includes many farmers and ranchers in South Dakota and around the country. And ignoring or de-emphasizing trade puts those jobs in jeopardy. But, Mr. President, it's not just that our economy already depends on trade, it's that trade, and specifically free trade, trade characterized by low or no tariffs and fewer market barriers, is a powerful engine of prosperity and economic growth. To name just one example, U.S. farm and food product exports grew from $46.1 billion in 1994 to more than $177 billion in 2021, largely due to greater market access opportunities for American exporters. Free trade helps create economic prosperity. It opens new jobs and opportunities for American workers. And it helps grow U.S. businesses and, by extension, our economy. President Biden has tended to de-emphasize the benefits of trade for our economy and for American workers, and suggests that trade and a robust U.S. manufacturing footprint are somehow in competition. But increased trade actually helps domestic manufacturing. 60% of U.S. imports are intermediary goods or materials for use in American manufacturing. Removing unnecessary barriers to trade in those goods would generally lower the prices for those materials, which would help and not hurt manufacturing. And while we're talking about lowering prices, I should note that expanding U.S. free trade would promote lower prices for a lot of the goods that Americans buy and help ease some of the supply chain problems we've been experiencing. That could help alleviate the historic inflation crisis the President and Democrats helped create and improve the economic outlook for Americans. But, Mr. President, while economic benefits are a leading reason to prioritize increased trade, they are far from the only reason. Free trade agreements don't just provide an opportunity for economic growth, they also provide an opportunity to develop important strategic relationships and foster ties with our allies. Free trade agreements don't just cement economic ties between countries, they cement friendships. They also provide an opportunity to advance U.S. priorities abroad, security priorities, economic priorities, diplomatic priorities, and more. Mr. President, as I said, the President has de-emphasized trade during the first 2 years of his administration. But while the U.S. has been inactive in the trade space, the rest of the world has not. For example, China recently joined the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, a trade agreement that eventually will eliminate more than 90% of tariffs on commerce in 15 member countries. China is also negotiating or implementing a number of new trade agreements to add to those of which it is currently a part. And China is far from the only country pushing ahead with free trade agreements, while the United States is sitting on the sidelines. We may be a world superpower, but we have just 14 free trade agreements currently in effect with 20 countries, meaning that many of our goods and services face significant tariff barriers in most places around the globe. Now, by comparison, the European Union has 46 trade agreements with 78 countries, meaning that European goods often have a leg up on the global stage. Under the Biden administration, the United States is getting left behind when it comes to global trade. And if we don't meaningfully re-enter the trade arena, we're going to slip further and further behind. Mr. President, I believe that an excellent way to re-enter the trade arena would be to conclude a free trade agreement with one of our closest friends and allies, the United Kingdom, something that is long overdue. Earlier this month, I introduced a bipartisan bill with Senator Chris Coons. It's called the Undertaking Negotiations on Investment and Trade for Economic Dynamism Act, or the United Act, the acronym. But the legislation is designed to advance a free trade agreement with the United Kingdom. Our legislation would authorize the administration to negotiate and conclude a trade agreement with the United Kingdom to open export opportunities for businesses of all sizes, increase the resilience of critical supply chains, and advance economic prosperity for people in both of our countries. At a time of financial and geopolitical turbulence, cementing our relationships with our allies should be a top priority. And an agreement with the United Kingdom, our nation's fifth largest export market and our largest services trading partner in the entire world, would further strengthen the ties that bind our two nations while resulting in economic gains for both British and American citizens. Important groundwork toward a comprehensive free trade agreement has already been laid, including the bilateral negotiations initiated by President Trump and President Biden's attempt to strengthen economic cooperation through the U.S.-UK dialogue on the future of Atlantic trade. And with the recently announced Windsor Framework, which provides a pathway on post-Brexit trading arrangements in Northern Ireland, the timing is right to kickstart negotiations. An agreement with the United Kingdom would further strengthen the ties that bind our two nations while resulting in economic gains for both American and British citizens. Mr. President, while the administration may have put trade at the bottom of its priority list over the past 2 years, the President's trade representative, Catherine Tai, seems to have at least kept the door open to working on increased market access, that is, tariff reduction and real trade agreements. For the sake of our country, I hope the administration will follow through. The Biden administration may have gotten off to a very slow start on the trade front, but it is not too late to turn things around. And I strongly urge the President to turn his focus to a more ambitious trade agenda, one that will provide durable economic and security benefits to American workers and businesses and advance American leadership in the world. Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I suggest the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.